Well, hello again. Now, following on from my musings, or some might say rant, at the end of the previous video about the future of AM broadcasting in Britain, I thought I might divert a little bit this week and also indulge in a bit of work avoidance and talk about how the markings on radios, particularly in the AM and the British sections of that, have changed over the years. Now we're at the end of 2022. The BBC has declared this to be its centenary year. This isn't strictly correct. The BBC that was formed in 1922 was not the British Broadcasting Corporation that we know and occasionally love today. It was called the British Broadcasting Company, and it was not the same sort of animal either. It was a commercial organisation formed by an alliance of British and American radio companies, which was there to lobby the British government into allowing radio transmissions on the basis that it wasn't possible to flog radios unless there was something to listen to. It was only 4 or 5 years later that various political events in Britain led to the BBC being formed as a public company with a charter to do things in the public interest, and that's the BBC that we have today. And strictly speaking, the BBC's centenary should be either 4 or 5 years later than it is. Why they're celebrating it now, I'm not sure. I suspect they're slightly worried that they may not be around for the real one. Now, when these companies finally got their way, which was really no mean feat given the intransigence of the British General Post Office, which was the keeper of all the rights to communication at that time, they set up stations in various cities across the country, like London, Manchester, Birmingham, Newcastle, and there wasn't really any way at that time of linking these stations up and doing a national service like the sort of things you see today. That technology only came about 2 or 3 years later when they could use post office wires to link the radio stations together. So pretty much each station did its own thing. There was a considerable bit of rationalisation that had to take place in the mid-20s because by that time other European countries had also started broadcasting, and it was necessary to have international agreements to make sure that everybody wasn't on the same or conflicting frequencies and stepping on each other's toes. So by that time the BBC had got to a situation where there was really 2 services. There was what was known as a regional programme, which had differences between regions, and a national programme which was the same across the country. That carried on until the beginning of World War II, and at that point it was felt that having regional broadcasting service was a bit of a risk, as they could be used by enemy aircraft for navigation. So all of the services were combined into one, which became known as the Home Service. There was also a service created known as the Forces Programme. Now this was more for the entertainment and keeping up the morale of the troops and things like that, although because it was less boring than the Home Service, quite a lot of people who were not in the armed forces listened to it as well. When the war finished, the Forces Programme was kept on, but renamed effectively as the Light Programme, acknowledging that it was listened to by people who were not in the armed forces. The Home Service stayed as it was, but the regionalisation sort of came back to an extent. And they also instituted a thing called the Third Programme. Now, this was supposed to be a highbrow arts-type programme, which only broadcast in the evenings. Interestingly enough, the Third Programme broadcast under different sort of monikers. One was Network 3, which came in the late 1950s. Sometimes also it's listed as being the music programme. So they were never quite clear what to call this or what it was for. But this state of affairs is pretty much where radios that are featured on this channel are starting from. You might be getting bored of the slideshow now and want to have a look at some actual radios. Let's start with this one, which is one of the oldest that I have, built in the year that I was born. And by that time, not much had changed in the 15 or so years since World War II. We had pretty much the same layout of BBC stations on AM. You can see the Light programme here is on 1500 longwave. That frequency was originally created for the national programme because of its wide coverage. It was set up before the war and abandoned during the war. When they restarted it and used the Light programme, it was allocated to that. There's also a fill-in frequency here for the Light programme on 247 metres medium wave. You've got the Third programme sitting down here on 194 metres, and then you've got the main Home Service here, which is 330, I think, and then various regional opt-outs. Just as an aside, which hasn't really got much to do with this, you can see here there's a Luxembourg broadcast on long wave. As I'm recording this, it's Christmas Eve 2022. If you want to catch that French language service on longwave, you've got a few days left to do it, because that's another station which is being closed down forever at the end of this year, so the attrition of AM services sadly goes on. And this state of affairs carried on for a few more years, but in the early 60s, obviously, pop music became a thing, and the BBC wasn't really interested in broadcasting much of that. Despite a lot of pressure from people who wanted to listen to it, they'd give it a few hours every week in a sort of condescending manner on the Light programme. Now, this was filled in by this service here from Luxembourg on 208, and that carried on as a mainstream thing, really, up until the 70s, even towards the 80s, really. And certainly in the 60s and 70s, people of my generation can remember listening to that in the evenings when Radio 1 wasn't available. So that was one way you could listen to pop music on the radio. The other way was that a lot of what they call pirate radio stations had set up around Britain. Now, these were stations that were operating just outside British territorial waters, either off old ships or old World War II forts that they'd taken over. These were not technically legal, but because they were outside territorial waters, there wasn't a lot the government could do about them. And they broadcast pop music all day and were therefore very popular. Obviously, they weren't generally shown on the dials of radio sets, although I think there are one or two around that would have shown Caroline on there. I don't have one of those, but I have seen them in other people's channels. Now, the BBC, understandably, was quite outraged at the idea that people who didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge might be making radio programmes. So they lobbied very hard against the government for the law to be extended to take these people off the air. And BBC officials made various allegations in a sort of Lavender Hill mob fantasy of fire engines crashing into school buses because their radios went wrong. But what really turned public opinion against the pirates was their own behaviour. Quite a lot of these stations were run by rather unsavoury characters. And when an actual act of piracy at Radio City, which was one of the forts just off Essex, was followed by the owner of Radio City being shot dead in an argument in Essex, then the idea that, Britain was being surrounded by a bunch of gangsters had a lot more resonance with the public, many of whom probably wouldn't have listened to anything but the Light programme anyway. So an act was passed to make these things illegal, but quid pro quo for that was the BBC had to introduce a pop radio station. It wasn't very keen on that, so it gave it the naffest frequency it could, which was this Light programme fill-in on 247, and so we got to the new arrangement in 1967. So this is the situation after the Marine Offences Act 1967. To demonstrate it, I've used this Bush TR230 radio, which is a project I haven't started on yet. Bush AM radios sound really good, and this one is no exception. It's electrically, it's got pretty much nothing to do with it, I think, but mechanically it's got a few issues that I need to fix, but otherwise it's a really good radio. And this shows that Radio 1 is now here on 247, where the Light programme fill-in used to be. You've got Radio 2, is a renamed Light programme here still on 1500 metres, and you've got Radio 3, which took over from the third programme, Network 3 and whatever else it was calling itself this week. And then you've got Radio 4 here, and the various regional variations which still existed for that. Now, you also notice on this radio that it's got a preset button for BBC Radio 1 on 247. Which is a bit of a follow-on from earlier versions of this radio, which seemed to have one for Luxembourg, when that was before Radio 1 existed. So they would have had a Luxembourg button, this changed to a Radio 1 button. Now, obviously, when you select it now, you don't get Radio 1, but you do still get Absolute Radio. You also get the fact that all the buttons are stuck, which is one of the things I have to look at. If they'd left it as a Luxembourg one, you'd get absolutely nothing now, because the Luxembourg 208 transmitter shut down years ago. Now, this arrangement didn't actually stay in place for that long, historically, only about 10 years. And then a few issues became apparent. One was that Radio 1 had a frequency allocation which was total pants, even though it was the most popular station. The other was that Radio 1 and Radio 2 were actually rather a shared network. There was only really about 4 or 5 hours of coverage on Radio 1 during the day, and they sort of relied on Radio 1 broadcasting Radio 2 on that frequency, because not everybody had longwave. So they still needed the light programme fill-in. On the coverage side, you can't just improve that by turning up the wick on the 247 transmitter, because if you do that, there's a lot of these transmitters across the country. It's fine if you're near to one of them and not near to any of the others, but then you don't have the problem in the first place. If you're anywhere in between the coverage areas, having both transmitters radiating more power causes interference between the two. And this was an issue they knew about, because they had that problem when they combined all the home service transmitters during the war in order to avoid giving navigation signals to German bombers. So what they decided to do was to give Radio 1 and Radio 2 two medium wave frequencies each, so that they'd be separate, and therefore you could turn the power up on both of them without affecting the others in the marginal coverage areas. And this happened in November 1978. Now, I don't have many sets that show that arrangement of frequencies. I had a look around. This is one of them, and it's a project that I obviously haven't started on yet. This does actually show the markings for the post-1978 arrangement. Unfortunately, as you can see, the scale cover is in such a mess and it's got so many scratches and fading and all sorts of other stuff that you can't actually see any of the markings on it. However, I will mention this is one we will look at shortly, hopefully. And this is a really nice set, this Panasonic. It makes brilliant sound, and a bit like the Bush, it's electrically quite sound, but mechanically in an absolutely dreadful state. So there's a fair bit of work to do on that, but I'm very optimistic that we can get something good out of this radio. Anyway, that's not helping this particular video very much. So here's a somewhat less interesting radio, which shows more clearly the changes that came about in 1978. Radio 4 is now on long wave, where Radio 2 used to be. When people talk about the great tradition of Radio 4's shipping forecast, it actually is a great tradition going back only to 1978. The shipping forecast is tied to the frequency, not to the channel, because the long wave coverage was needed in order to be able to reach ships. Anyway, the other thing that happened at the time was Radio 4 was briefly renamed Radio 4 UK to reflect the fact that it had absorbed all the regional things, and it was now a fully national station. Of the others, you can see that Radio 1 and Radio 2 here now have their separate, have two frequencies each, which allow them to have better coverage across the country. There are a couple of Radio 4 fill-ins you can see. I'm not sure about that one. That one, the 721, is still in existence for London. I can't pick it up on this radio, but I can pick it up on my car radio, even though we're about 50 miles out of London. And Radio 3 has been moved off to the old Radio 1 frequency. The thinking there, of course, was that people listening to Radio 3 are listening to high-quality classical music and don't necessarily want to listen to it on medium wave anyway. Although Radio 3 medium wave did still carry the cricket commentary, and that went on for quite a while until it got moved eventually when the Radio 3 medium wave service closed down. It's now carried on Radio 4 long wave. You'll notice also at this point that the VHF side, BBC radios 1 and 2, had a sort of combined VHF service, so Radio 1 didn't get a full FM service at that point, which meant that they still were relying on medium wave when a lot of their competitors that had come up, like Capital Radio and other commercial stations that had appeared in the meantime, did have FM frequencies and had obviously much better quality sound available. So the fact that the BBC's flagship national pop station didn't have a proper full day high quality sound service was a bit of an issue, and it took a while to resolve that, because what they had to do was shift all the police and other emergency services off the top end of the FM band. Now, if you remember looking at some previous videos, things like the old Hackers only went to 101, and the reason for that was all this was allocated to emergency services. Eventually, when all those were moved off, they can move the commercial services up here, and then they gave Radio 1 an allocation around here. So this didn't carry on very long either, unfortunately. In the late 1980s, the government decided to involve itself in radio broadcasting yet again, and how can that ever go wrong? And they decided to have a whinge about the fact that Radio 2 was being broadcast simultaneously, or simulcasting as they called it, on VHF and on medium wave, and the same occurred for Radio 3, and the same was occurring for Radio 4, and they had to go at the commercial stations on the same basis. Around that time I was working for Piccadilly Radio in Manchester, and we were forced to split the 261 medium wave AM service to have different programmes from the FM service on 103. There wasn't any particular desire to do that, and there were reasons not to do it because the coverage areas were different and you'd segmented the audience in ways that weren't necessarily good. But none of these technical arguments made any difference to the government. All they were concerned about was you'd have more options to sell licenses and collect more money. So everybody was forced to reuse their frequencies and not broadcast the same thing on two different frequencies. Now, the only set I can show which illustrates that phase is this monstrosity, which we featured in an earlier video. It's a Steepletone knockoff of a Roberts radio, a sort of fake retro thing, but it does show what happened to the rest of the frequencies. So you can see where Radio 3 medium wave had previously been. That was then given to Virgin. Virgin Radio was then later replaced by Absolute Radio, which is there now. Virgin Radio has since been relaunched as an internet-only station to confuse matters further. You can see that the BBC had reused the Radio 2 frequencies. Their initial way to do this was to create a network called Radio 5, into which they threw all sorts of unrelated stuff. Didn't really last very long in that form. People couldn't work out what it was for. They rebranded it a couple of years later as Radio 5 Live, which it is now, and it's still on those frequencies. And it's basically a dedicated news and sports network. You can see also we have TalkSport, which took over the Radio 1 medium wave frequencies, which it was able to do once Radio 1 had got full coverage on VHF. And that's sort of where the story ends, really, because you tend to find with newer radios that people don't bother putting the station names on anymore, and I think that's quite sensible. I have quite a few other radios, like Philips ones, which don't show the station names, and I think that's a good idea, because certainly in the modern world, where there are takeovers and rebrands every few weeks, or it seems like it anyway, you're just playing a losing game trying to stay up to date with that. In any case, we're moving into the age of digital radio. People don't really know in DAB what frequency their station is being broadcast on. So yeah, I think that's pretty much the end of the story. I'd like to point out before I go that there are 2 or 3 sites that I found while researching stuff for this, which I found were very good. And I'll put the links to those in the description. I think you should check them out. So there's a couple on one of them, the Frequency Finder one. There's a couple of very good essays on the likely future of AM and FM radio, which has been updated fairly recently. Pessimistic outlook, as we covered in the last video, but I think it is well researched and very interesting. So if you're watching this on the day that it was created, have a Merry Christmas. Please don't have a Merry Christmas if you're watching on catch-up. It won't count, and you could still be charged. See you on the next video. Bye.